Let's learn watercolor techniques. In this video, we're going to go over basically all the ways that watercolor can be used. Hi students, it's Ms.Boley here. So we're going to practice some different techniques with watercolors. So we're going to need some watercolor paper or your visual journal, some brushes, a plastic lid or just something, it could be the lid of your palette, your watercolor paint palette, something to mix the paints with, and you're going to need some paints. This is a different type of paint palette than what I showed you last week, but just watch the video from last week if you want to see the other kind of paint palette. You're going to need some paper towels and a cup of water. So some of the other things you might need are some salt. Sounds weird, I know, and some saran wrap. So you'll see how we'll use those later. Some masking tape and a crayon or other kind of wax you can use for making a wax resist. So I'm going to start out by doing a little puddle of water. I'm going to dip my brush into my water and I'm going to make a puddle of water on my paint palette. Okay, now I'm going to go and put some paint onto my brush and I'm going to mix the paint with the water on my palette. Okay, now I'm going to test out what this looks like, what this wash looks like on my scrap piece of watercolor paper. And I'm going to add a bit more paint. All right, so now I'm going to do what's known as a wash. So I'm dipping into my paint and making a stripe on my paper. And then I'm dipping back into my paint, making a stripe on my paper. And each time I make a stripe, I'm going to dip back into my paint. So a wash is meant to cover a large area in just one color. And it's meant to just be all one color, right? That's why I'm dipping back into my paint each time. So I'm going to get even coverage with the paint. So there we go. There's my wash. And if I have any pooling, I can take my paper towel and I can dry my brush off and I can suction up some of that water around the edges if I don't want it. If I'm fine with it, then I can just leave it. All right, now I'm going to wash my brush off and I'm going to try a different technique. So I'm going to mix up another wash. So I'm going to put another little puddle of water on my palette. This way of mixing washes, it makes your colors more vibrant. They don't mix together as much. Yeah, this is the way that I prefer to use watercolors. So I'm going to make another little puddle. This time I'm going to pick a different color. So I'm going to pick this like darker blue. Looking back, I probably should have picked more of a different color from my first one. What I'm doing now is known as a variegated wash. So I'm going to try to make this darker blue wash fade into the lighter blue wash that I did before. So remember, I'm just trying out a bunch of techniques. Okay, I'm going to test out my wash to see what it looks like, and I feel like it's a little too light, so I'm adding a tiny bit more paint and mixing it up really well. And then I'll test it one more time. That looks good to me. So I'm going to do a stripe of that color, and instead of dipping back into that color, I'm going to dip into the other color this time. I'm going to dip into that light blue. So you can kind of see it is fading from the darker blue to the lighter blue. Okay, and then I do have a bit of pooling up in the corner there, so I will dry my brush off. I'm doing that off camera so you can't see it. I'm drying it off, and then I can suction up the pools over on the side. There we go. So now I'm going to try a graded wash. So I'm going to make a puddle again. I always start out the same way. I make a puddle, and then I add the paint, and I mix it up, and then I test it out on my scrap paper. So I'm mixing in some of this red paint into my little puddle on my palette, and then I will test it. That's an optional step, but it is really helpful. So now I'm going to do my graded wash. So dipping into the paint, doing a stripe, then dipping into the water, doing a stripe of water, doing another stripe of water. And I could continue doing more and more stripes of water until it's as light as I want it to be. All right, one more technique, lifting wet. There's a couple different ways you can lift the paint. So I'm doing just a regular wash, dipping back into the paint, doing a stripe, dipping into the paint, doing a stripe. And I'm going to use my paper towel to pick up some of the paint that's on my paper. So I'm just gonna dab with my paper towel, kind of make some little cloud type texture. There's another way of lifting, which I'll show you in a second. All right, so this technique I'm gonna try is called wet on wet. So watercolor, if you paint wet watercolor on top of more wet watercolor, it's gonna kind of like blend together and make a really nice wet effect. So I'm making a wash of that reddish color. I'm gonna paint the wash, dipping back in the red paint each time. And I don't really care about making it like a flat area of color right now because I'm doing a different technique. And then I'm gonna use some purple and paint it on top of my wet wash. And notice how the water just like, it just like goes outward and mixes in with the red. So you'll see when it dries, it looks really cool. I'm dipping directly into my paint palette here to get some really saturated purple paint. All right, so here's another way of lifting. So what I'm doing is I'm painting a purple wash, dipping back into the purple paint each time. And then what I'll do is I'll dry off my brush, and then I'm going to lift the paint off with my dry brush. So it's a really interesting thing you can do. So drying my brush, I'm gonna do little dots. So I'm just lifting little dots. So totally different look and different result from the paper towel, but it's the same idea. I'm basically lifting paint off of the paper. So watercolor is really nice. If you make a mistake, you can always lift the mistake up usually. All right, so wax resist is another technique. So I'm doing some lines with a white crayon. You cannot see them right now because the crayon is white and the paper is white. Now I'm gonna mix a wash of brown. So I've started with my puddle, mixing paint in, more paint. And I'll test it out, okay, looks great. And then I will paint my brown wash over top of my wax crayon. Oh, here we go. And where I've colored with the crayon, the paint will not stick. So the part with the crayon stays white. Another way I can mask off areas is I can use masking tape. So these are just little strips of masking tape that I've ripped off from my roll that I showed you earlier. And I can just paint over top of them, and the areas where I've put the tape will stay white. So remember, we don't have a white paint. We don't have a white paint color in our palette, so we always need to use the white of the paper if we want something to be white. So we need to think ahead. If we want something to be white, we have to mask it off ahead of time, either with a wax crayon or with masking tape, or I guess just by not painting in that area. But we do need to plan ahead because you can't really add white on later unless you use a different kind of paint, unless you use acrylic paint. All right, so I've painted my purple wash on top of my masking tape. I gotta let it dry before I remove the masking tape. Okay, I'm gonna do a technique called glazing, which is where I do a wash of one color and I let it dry. So I'm gonna do a couple stripes of brown wash over here, and I'm just going to let them dry when I'm done. Letting things dry in watercolor painting is super, super important. So I'll let that area dry and I'll move on to a different technique. So what I'm doing here is I'm mixing a wash, using that darker blue again, and I'm painting the wash onto the paper. Making sure that the color is kind of even as I possibly can get it. All right, so now I'm gonna put some sea salt on top, or just regular salt is fine as well. I'm gonna sprinkle it on there, and I'm just gonna let that dry, and the salt will absorb the paint, and it'll cause a bunch of little dots. So that is kind of similar. It's gonna look similar to what I did when I did the lifting with my paintbrush. All right, so now I'm gonna use that saran wrap I showed you earlier. So I'm painting a variegated wash with two colors, a brown and a red, and I'm saturating it with quite a bit of paint, making it kind of dark, and then I'm just gonna smush my saran wrap on top of it. I'm just kind of trying to arrange it. Just smushed it right down, and now I have to let it dry. Okay, one more is called dry brushing. So I'm using a smaller brush. I've just put a teeny little bit of water and then kind of dried it off almost with my paper towel, and taking paint directly from my paint palette. I'm not mixing a wash here. I'm just taking it directly from the paint palette so that it's pretty dry, and then I'm brushing it on. So this is good for if I ever want to do like an outline or details, or if I ever want to do texture like grass or fur or something like that, I might do dry brushing. All right, so now my glazing area is dry, that part where I did those two brown stripes, those 4 brown stripes. Now I'm gonna mix a dark blue wash, and I'm gonna paint over top of my brown. So if you notice, the parts where the brown is are a different color from where the blue is, just the blue by itself. That's known as glazing. So I'm mixing the colors, but I'm not mixing them when they're in paint form. I'm mixing them once they're dry on the paper. All right, so you can remove my saran wrap, and that's what I'm left with, and I remove my masking tape, and that's what I'm left with. All right, so here are the different techniques we tried. You can pause the video here, and then I'd like you to try out 3 to 5 of these techniques in your visual journal and reflect on how they went. So please choose one of the washes, so at least one of the ones in the first row. I hope you have fun with watercolors. Thank you so much for watching.